Human rights are rights without limits because they're universal rights, the rights of all people everywhere. This universal ambition makes us think big. So we've made human rights the business of international organizations that hold governments accountable for their human rights performance. Monitoring states on human rights is very important. But is it enough? Are we not limiting the potential of human rights by putting them out there? Can we think of a different scenario in which human rights are also right here, close to us? You know, I've been working on human rights for more than 20 years, and you may think that this generates a feeling of having seen it all. But increasingly, I also feel that there's a lot that I have not seen, that I may have been blind to. Let me share a story about the discovery of my own blindness. Now, this happened in the course of my work on the rights of Muslim minorities in Europe, more specifically on the so-called burqa ban. Now, this issue came on the human rights agenda in 2009, 2010, as the Belgian and French parliaments started to work in earnest toward a nationwide criminal ban on face covering. At our Human Rights Center at Ghent University, we did legal research on that, checking the proposed ban against human rights standards. And we also interviewed women wearing a face veil in Belgium. And it was when we started digging into this that we found out that in many places, face covering was already banned in local police rules, assorted with administrative fines. In fact, it seemed that almost every town where a face veil had ever been spotted had such a local ban in place. And this had remained under the radar of human rights activists and scholars alike. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the Council of Europe, they issued their press releases only when the nationwide ban was about to be adopted. What nobody realized was that on the ground, this nationwide ban did not change all that much. This made me realize that I had ignored the role of cities and of city leaders in human rights protection. And that this was not just my personal blindness, but a collective blindness of some of the human rights community. You know, it's been more than 70 years since the adoption of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights in 1948. But today, the positive impact of human rights for most people's lives is just too limited. Some people want to give up on human rights. Did you know that? Some top scholars even are saying human rights are a utopia of the past. It hasn't worked. We should abandon it. If you don't agree with that, if we want to hold on to human rights among our basic values, human rights may need to step up its game. We need to bring in human rights talk and human rights thinking in more contexts. One such context is that of cities. Now, this is why city leaders are important for human rights protection. First of all, because we live in an urban time. Today, Europe is already more than 73% urban. North America, 81.5%. And the rest of the world is getting there fast. Two, because city governments have a lot of powers that impact upon our enjoyment of our human rights. They affect your free speech when they decide to ban a manifestation, and your religious freedom when they allow the building of a house of worship. Local police can treat you well, or not so well. Municipal housing policy affects your right to housing, and municipal schools, your right to education. So it should come as no surprise that a lot of human rights violations take place at the level of the city. The most extreme example is probably that of the current president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte. You may have heard of him. He was a mayor for more than 20 years in Davao City, where he was known as the Death Squad mayor. He used and encouraged extrajudicial killings as a means to rid his city of criminals and street children. This policy of blatant human rights violations cost more than 1,000 lives, and national authorities turned a blind eye to this. As a president, he even encouraged this as a matter of national policy. You know, these international organizations that monitor human rights, they talk to states, not to cities. Look at an example in Europe, that of evictions of Roma families from slums in France, leaving families out on the streets without any resources. More than 10,000 people were evicted like that just last year alone. Several United Nations human rights bodies are talking to the French government about this, asking them, please do not evict people without providing for alternative accommodation. But in fact, most of these eviction decisions are taken by local authorities on the basis of typical local policy arguments, such as health, hygiene, and safety. They do not frame their policies in human rights terms because they're not held accountable in human rights terms. And when these United Nations bodies talk to the French Republic and issue their very critical reports, how do we know that these even reach the actual perpetrators at the city level? The same holds for the work of human rights NGOs. You know, they are crucial watchdogs, and they work mainly through pressure, through so-called naming and shaming. That makes it all the more surprising that they rarely name the city as the site of human rights violations. Take Amnesty International's annual report that was released just last week. I browsed it for you, and I looked for cases in which peaceful demonstrations were unreasonably banned or interfered with, because that's in many countries a typical local power exercised by mayors, city councils, local police. Across the annual report, I found this type of violation in 40 countries. Only 3 times a local authority was mentioned, and only 3 other times a national authority. All the other references were very vague to the authorities or the police. Could be national, could be local, but in most cases we're talking about completely different political parties between the national and the local level. And in almost all cases, we're talking about completely different individuals who are actually the perpetrators of the violations. So you can imagine that this has me wonder, how exactly does naming and shaming work if you don't even tell people which level of authorities are to blame? So what I'm saying is, we should bring mayors and other city leaders into the picture as perpetrators of human rights violations. But I also want to share the positive side of this coin, which is that city leaders can also be leaders of human rights protection, and some are taking good steps in this direction. What sometimes happens is that cities step in to fill a gap left by national authorities. The United States, for example, has not ratified some of the main human rights treaties, that on women's rights and that on children's rights. Well, some US cities have decided to start implementing these treaties on their own, in their city. So Los Angeles and San Francisco are implementing CEDAW, the Women's Rights Convention, and Chicago is doing the same with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Did you know that some cities even go directly against national policies which they consider to violate human rights? You may have heard of the American sanctuary cities that offer protection against deportation to irregular migrants, and that the Trump administration now wants to deprive of federal funding. But closer to home, in 2015, Utrecht and several other Dutch cities rejected as inhumane a new Dutch immigration policy because it would no longer offer any support to people who had failed their asylum procedure. Defying this national new policy, these cities continue to offer what they call bed, bath, and bread to these people. Some cities even take a position on an international human rights issue. I took this picture last month at the Israeli separation wall near Bethlehem. It's a message of the Dutch city of Gorinchem in South Holland, and it reads, "The people of Gorinchem greet you. They say no to the separation wall, and they support the full rights of the Palestinian people." Yes, some cities are working for human rights. There is even a network of so-called human rights cities. But these positive examples are just too few. Human rights are not yet part of the vocabulary of most city leaders. And that is because we do not hold them accountable in human rights terms. Where is the international body monitoring the human rights performance of cities? Where's the ranking of cities that best protect human rights or that violate the most? And where is the much needed protection for courageous city leaders defying rights-trampling governments? Let's take this home. If we want human rights to be real, we should claim them also from our city leaders. Thank you.